I'm Samantha, this is Krista, and we're here to help you be a better landlord. So Krista, let's start with the basics. What is hoarding?
Yes, so hoarding is actually a complicated mental condition. It's diagnosable from the DSM-5. If you are not familiar, that is the diagnostic manual used by the American Psychiatry Association. It lists all sorts of different conditions, including this one. So hoarding specifically is tied to the idea that someone has an excess of objects that they cannot get rid of. And thinking about getting rid of these objects often causes distress, interpersonal conflict, etc. And it goes beyond just having an eclectic collection. It moves into the territory of either sincerely not having enough space for these items or keeping broken or otherwise damaged goods that you can't really use, but still not being able to part with them because of this feeling that things are going to go wrong if you do. It can vary in terms of intensity, but it is a disability according to both the DSM-5 and the Fair Housing Act.
Okay, well, that was my next question. We said disability, so I know the Fair Housing Act has to play into this somehow. Tell me more about that.
Absolutely. So as we know, the Fair Housing Act protects 7 specific classes from undue discrimination. One of those classes is based on disability. Because of that, people with hoarding condition or hoarders are protected under the Fair Housing Act, which means here that you as a landlord cannot deny someone housing because they are a hoarder. However, that doesn't mean that you can't continue to screen and otherwise communicate with tenants if you do think that there is a hoarding issue, but we do have to have a lot of empathy and compassion when we move through these kinds of tough conversations.
What is the difference between being messy and being a hoarder?
Ooh, there's a clear distinction. So being a hoarder is diagnosable, and the main diagnosing criteria is the distress that someone feels when trying to part with the items or even when thinking about parting with the items. So someone who's messy is not necessarily going to feel that level of distress. This is regardless of how much their actual mess has piled up, right? Like there usually isn't any kind of emotional tie to it in the same way that a hoarder would feel emotionally compelled to keep the belongings, regardless of their value, regardless of their functionality, and that is where it truly becomes a disability.
What are some signs that someone might be hoarding?
You might see an overwhelming collection of items that grows over time, right? So maybe it's something kind of small, just disorganized clutter, but it will slowly start to scale until there are designated pathways through the house. And these pathways can often not include exits. So they break the code of the housing itself because there are things in the way. If there's an emergency situation, hoarders often struggle to get out. You might even see clutter start to overflow from the inside of the property into the outside or even into common areas. So it's not just disorganization in the actual unit, there could also be disorganization on the lawn. In particularly bad cases, you might even struggle to access the physical unit because of the amount of clutter and disorganization. This also pops up with interpersonal relationships. So if you have, say, a multifamily property and someone in Unit A has hoarding disorder and someone in Unit B does not, you might hear complaints from the person in Unit B, either because of the clutter itself or because, unfortunately, hoarding disorder often invites pests and other kinds of critters to come in. When there is that much clutter, cockroaches, mice, spiders, all sorts of things can crawl in there, and it can start to impact everyone who's nearby, including other tenants. Unfortunately, sometimes hoarding progresses to such a degree that the tenant is hoarding animals. So one, if you don't allow pets at your property and you start seeing signs of pets, definitely make sure that you're having those conversations with tenants. Once they start hoarding animals, it is a felony in most states. It is animal abuse. So you might have to work with your local law enforcement or otherwise try and resolve the situation at a more legal degree than a scaled back hoarding situation.
How can I prevent hoarding in my rentals?
So there are 2 ways to look at this, right? One is before you actually have a lease signed or before there's an active situation. So I would take my lease agreement and I would make sure that it has language in there to, 1, clarify how often I will be conducting inspections. I would recommend at least inspecting once every 6 months, but once a quarter is even better. That way you can maintain a good relationship with your tenant. You're regularly interacting with them. You're giving them the chance to ask questions and point out things that might need resolved, but also that gives you a good leg up on starting to see the signs of hoarding before it gets to an overwhelming spot. You'll also want to make sure that there's language in your lease dictating what happens if a hoarding situation pops up. So that could mean an expectation to have a conversation with the tenant if there are exits being blocked, or having resources listed out for where they might be able to find assistance on their own if they are experiencing hoarding disorder. Having that information from the jump is going to be a lot easier than trying to intervene in an active situation. You should probably also outline consequences for what happens if this situation unfolds even further and it starts to kind of spiral into a place where you're struggling to regain control. So that could mean, hey, if I've missed 3 inspections with you, there's going to be a mandatory one in which we go through and I will be looking for code violations, etc., which we'll have to resolve within a specific time frame. You'll also want to make sure that you're familiar with your local landlord-tenant laws and see if there are any additional stipulations that you should be considering when you're bulking up your lease. Now, in my research, I didn't find anything specifically related to hoarding disorder, but that doesn't mean that it won't pop up by the time that you're beefing up your next lease. So do your due diligence, look around, make sure that you know exactly what you can and can't say in your locality regarding this disability. Once you've done that, you should be in a good spot. However, if you have an active hoarding situation right now, that's going to be a little bit different. Again, approach it with compassion and empathy because this is a disability, but you want to start having conversations with your tenant sooner rather than later. If it's just at kind of a first stage where things are disorganized, but it's not overwhelming, you can still move around the property, make sure that you are explaining to them your expectations for how things should be kept, how often things should be cleaned, and of course, keeping things up to code. So no blocking exits, no blocking windows, things of that nature so that they stay safe. I think making sure that you hit home on the fact that this is for their safety as well is a great way to tackle this kind of issue. And again, remember that this can be a lot of, it can bring a lot of shame for the renters, so you want to move through appropriately. I'm not saying you need to buy a Chase Lounge and start offering therapy in your office, but I am saying that you should go at this softer, gentler, with an air of we can work together to solve this rather than ostracizing them, shaming them, etc., because that's going to drive them further into the disability versus being a friendly ear who helps them move out of it. And one last thing I should say, to be a better landlord, start by being a good person. So that means maintaining connections with your tenants. Again, you don't have to be best friends, but making sure that they feel comfortable enough to come to you when there are issues or when they have questions. Keeping a human connection by checking in on the property every so often, making sure you're giving them proper notice, but then getting in there and checking to see how things are holding up, if they have any questions. Pointing out safety issues so that they can stay safe in your house and also so that you can mitigate some of these fears about the hoarding condition. Because again, hoarders are not this scary concept. I know it scares landlords, but it is a disability, and if we can look at it through that lens first, then it leads to a better resolution for all parties.
Thank you so much, Krista. I feel much better about handling a hoarding situation. And if you have any questions about hoarding, let us know down in the comments.
Don't forget to subscribe.